Section 4. The next step forward. I know this all seems pleasant and able to make things easier on you as an individual, but how is this going to help us as a species advance our culture beyond its present point? Well, the way I see it, the more sustainable you can make yourself, and the more you can simply use our present system to your advantage, rather than depend on it for your survival, the less stress you put on the system preventing it from transitioning to a new, more efficient state. At the very least, by becoming self-sustainable, you will reduce how you experience the stress and trauma inflicted on a populace when their system of governance changes, or any other hardships that may arise for that matter. Think of our economic system as an operating system for a computer. The version we are using now is like the most recent versions. Lots of programs, overly complicated even though made user-friendly, and appearing much the same as the original, but is in no way the same as the first version. Now, what did we have before major operating systems? Well, that was like the barter system. Now, these systems are meant to assist in operating within the world that is a sea of information that we call the Internet. However, most common operating systems are two-dimensional operating systems in a sea that has grown beyond 2 dimensions. So we obviously do not want to go back to the original versions, as many new programs will not function and it would not work efficiently in our present world. But the current 2-dimensional system is failing to reach the full potential of the 3-dimensional world it is now operating within. Now, new operating systems are being developed utilizing touchscreen technology that allows us to access that 3D sea of information with a more 2.5-dimensional interaction, eventually opening to the full 3-dimensional interactions of VR systems. The same thing is happening to our economic system. Even though we try to change the system as best we can while maintaining the original framework, it no longer is capable of accessing the true potential of the world we live in. We need a new system, better capable of efficiently using what is available. No matter whether we as a planet come to this realization and choose to change the system, a revolution brings about a traumatic transition, or we cling to the present system as long as possible until the inevitable environmental, social, and/or political collapse that forces us to seek a new system. The outcome is the same. Eventually, we will need to find an option for that change. In all my life, the only system I have heard suggesting moving forward beyond a monetary system without going back to a barter system is through a system called a resource-based economy. As I mentioned earlier, I was first introduced to this concept through different documentaries that led me to the founder of the Venus Project, Jacques Fresco. To paraphrase as he and the Venus Project describe, a resource-based economy is a holistic socio-economic system in which all goods and services are available without the use of money, credits, barter, or any other system of debt or servitude. All resources become the common heritage of all the inhabitants of the earth. Decisions will be reached using the scientific method and based off of available resources, rather than just the personal opinions of those in power. This will be done by delegating our decision-making to machines. An example he gives at this point is anyone who is concerned about delegating their decision-making to a machine need only realize if you have ever used a calculator, you have already delegated your decision-making to a machine. Now, I know that it is a lot to take in, and the average person will not immediately understand what it means. Most people, after thinking it through, come to the conclusion that they're saying we will make everything free and let machines tell us what to do. To this, most respond saying, "That doesn't sound very good to me," or "I don't think that will work." If you are one who is full of such doubts, I will direct you to my next section, because naysayers like this are the only problem we still have left to overcome to achieve this possibility. Other than the necessary involvement of humanity, the only things we need to achieve this system is the ability to produce more than we consume, access to the resources to maintain that level of production, the infrastructure to distribute said production efficiently to the populace, and a global information network capable of communicating with everyone around the world. As it should be obvious at this point, we do, in fact, have all of these criteria available to us at this time. So, how would such a system work? Well, to be honest, I have heard many hypotheticals on how different aspects of our culture would function in such a system, and have never found anyone who has put together an all-encompassing example of how such a system would work. Two reasons I can think of for avoiding such an explanation would be it is difficult for any individual to envision how such a system would come together when it requires the collective insight of all of humanity, and no one person is an expert in every field. Also, largely due to the first reason, the more detailed you attempt to make such an explanation, the more likely you will discourage people who either do not understand or otherwise disagree with the concept you have presented that may not even be necessary in the system. Since you were the one presenting the example, by presenting such a flaw, most people will consider the whole concept flawed, instead of trying to focus on the positive aspects. For these reasons and more, I want to stress as much as I can that the following is not an example of what others say how the system must function, but rather the ideas I personally have developed with my time studying the subject on how such a system might function. Also, I will add that what I will describe is just another step along the road, and many of the concepts I present may eventually become inefficient or otherwise be determined unnecessary in the future. We will likely never achieve a perfect system. There will always be room for improvement. First, we would need a database encompassing the production, distribution, and consumption of all the resources of the world. This would not only include the raw resources of the planet, but also the materials we produce, the energy we generate, and even our population numbers. Most, if not all, of this information already exists today, but to my knowledge, there is not one all-encompassing database to analyze all this information, largely due to the fact that hoarding and the drive for profits has caused many of these sources of information to be skewed so they are not an actual accurate evaluation of our present condition. Once we know exactly what is available, not only will we be better capable of deciding the most efficient use of our resources, but we can determine exactly how much of each resource an individual is responsible for. This will determine their individual shares. Likely, for the first couple years after the transition, and for each individual when they are still considered an adolescent, all individual shares would start set to public reserves. Once public reserve limits are met, and/or an individual comes of age and is considered an adult, their resources will be devoted to public works, unless otherwise designated by the individual. What are public reserve limits? These would be limits set on each individual resource, declaring how much we would need in storage to maintain the function of our society in light of most foreseeable events. Every individual upon birth has equal rights to all the resources available to humanity. As such, the first 10 years or more of our lives, those resources likely would go unaccessed by the individual. These resources are collected in a public reserve. This public reserve is necessary to compensate for the catastrophes that can hinder prosperity. This way, an individual can choose to devote their resources to the development of new projects and/or access their shares of the reserve to complete a personal project, such as the construction of a custom personal home. However, likely after accessing public reserves, resource allotments would only go to restoring the deficit to the reserves before being allowed to further develop new projects, such as public works projects. Unless the resource accessed in reserve is at a surplus of the set reserve limit, at which the individual shares can be devoted to any project, yet they will still may have no longer access to personal projects until using their resources to replenish what was used in the public reserves. Now, what are public works projects? Public works projects would be projects that are obviously for the betterment of all the community. These would include, but not be limited to, the production, development, and distribution of the necessities of life, such as food, water, medical care, education, shelter, and the basic maintenance to our infrastructure, as well as the development of new production and distribution methods. Anything devoted to public works that is not utilized will be added to the surplus public reserves. So even devoting your shares to public works projects can slowly restore any deficit to the public reserves. When an individual desires a specific project, like the construction of a unique home or personal design device, or the production of something else outside of the public works, they can devote their individual shares of the world's resources to that project. If the resources they desire are exotic or beyond their personal share of public reserves, this could result in an unreasonable amount of time for the project's completion, with only an individual's allotment applied. At this time, they can seek other people to contribute if it is something that may benefit many people, find an alternative to the scarce resource, or find a way to increase global production of said resource, not only decreasing the overall time of the production of their project, but earning a bonus of said resource to their project. In this way, even the most selfish projects will contribute to the rest of humanity. Next is something that is not mentioned in any of the literature or explanations on a resource-based economy that I have seen, and may even be contrary to the beliefs of those who support such a system. Nevertheless, in order for the system I am describing to function and allow each individual to access their individual shares of the world's resources and devote them to a project other than public works projects, it will require some form of citizen registration and certification system. This citizen registration could be something as simple as an identification designation given at birth, like a Social Security number in America. However, Given the freedom provided by this system and the lack of necessity to track each individual, it could be left as a matter of registering at a time you would like such an identification. Through the use of fingerprints, retinal patterns, and even facial recognition technologies, we can add numerous levels of security to this identification until such concerns become obsolete. Without the need to control each individual's decisions and limit access to the necessities of life, the need for such identification is very limited. Aside from the aforementioned access to an individual's shares of the world's resources, the only other purpose I can think of for such identification would be the reservation of certain items for prolonged personal use and the acquisition and regulation of certifications we deem necessary to perform certain hazardous tasks, at least until the time we can design such hazards out of the tasks. The criteria for receiving such certification may change drastically over time, but the use of such certification will remain relatively the same. Tasks that are deemed too hazardous or complicated to perform by the average individual will require some form of testing to prove your capabilities before being certified to perform such tasks. Depending on the task, the certification may require periodic renewal to prove you have retained the ability to perform such a task without posing a risk to yourself or others. This should be familiar, as most people recognize a driver's license is necessary to prove you know how to handle a motor vehicle. Enforcement might be needed in the beginning to prevent abuse of such new freedoms and to resist those who may attempt to circumnavigate the identification and certification systems. However, upon agreeing to these concepts, the use of simple computer lockouts should be all the regulation needed to prevent adolescent, immature, or otherwise aberrant behavior. Beyond that, such aberrant behaviors should be handled by counseling from volunteers certified in social behavioral studies and human psychology, helping identify the root problems and facilitate resolution. Through this practice, there will eventually no longer be a need for enforcement. As for the reservation system, this would be to prolong the use of things even when you are not presently occupying or possessing the unit. Primarily, this would be used for homes, allowing the occupant to travel the world freely, then return to their primary residence. They could even stay in another structure, simply occupying rather than reserving it for future use, while maintaining the reservation of their primary residence. This could be extended to just about anything we use, such as vehicles in order to run errands without constantly changing vehicles at every stop. Not only would this help prevent an individual from commandeering something that is being used by another, but also prevent an individual, inadvertently or not, from hoarding something and inhibiting others' ability to use said resource. The last thing I will mention here are the incentives instilled in such a system. Since most people are indoctrinated to believe monetary gain is necessary to incentivize productivity, they question how production will be maintained without money. Well, the first incentive in such a system would be the new ethics instilled in our children, explaining the old adage, one is all and all is one. Essentially, reaching the realization that any task you perform to benefit the community will in turn benefit yourself, and inversely, any task performed to help the individual will in turn help the community. Beyond that, as long as the system operates as I have described, there is the bonus that can be provided to any resource you improve the production of. Another option is the fact that every task you perform can be quantified in improving global efficiency. Even fixing an appliance, preventing it from being recycled, and a new version built to replace it, will increase global efficiency at least a fraction of a percent. This percentage can be tracked via an individual's designation and held as a point of pride, competing with others to achieve a greater percentage of increased global efficiency throughout their life and possibly gaining a name in historical record.